Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. We will be monitoring all things Orioles all week long. They are home this week, taking on the Red Sox, and the Rays come to town this weekend, and certainly got off to a sort of the second half we expect. The old three-game sweep at the hands of the Toronto Blue Jays. Almost won on Friday night and almost won on Sunday, but almost is close in what's that? Horseshoes and hand grenades and I guess nuclear holocaust as threatened by our president. But in this particular case, Zach Britton is the next guy to be tapped on the shoulder and be let off the Orange Island, I guess, and that could happen today, tomorrow, anytime. I'm surprised there's not more activity on Adam Jones at this point, and obviously Brad Brock is just not throwing the ball well right now. But over the weekend, we started to hear rumors about Bundy and Gausman and Scope and who else is for sale. It feels like the whole Magic Kingdom up for sale, huh?
Yeah, and that's not to say that the Orioles are going to trade any of those players that aren't pending free agents, but you like to hear that they're going to listen at least.
What is the value of Bundy right now? What is the value of Scope as he's scuffled through this year? It's going to be interesting to see what the offers would even be.
Yeah, and I think in the case of Bundy and Kevin Gausman, I think a lot of that is relative to the fact that this isn't considered to be a great starting pitcher market as it relates to the trade deadline. And look, you shouldn't give any of those guys away. I mean, you're in a position of, I don't want to say power, but you do have leverage in the sense that you don't have to trade those individuals, especially someone like Bundy who still has a few years of club control remaining. In the case of Jonathan Scope, I'm inclined to say probably not going to trade him now, probably shouldn't trade him right now because, well, even though he's had a good month of July, we've seen the season that Scope has had, so you're not exactly selling high on him unless some team is willing to pay more of a premium. So
yeah, you want to pay for last year's productivity, go for it.
Yeah, exactly, and I don't think anyone's going to do that at this point, so in the case of some of those guys, it might be best that you hold on to a Scope until the off season, and then you reevaluate then whether you want to invest in him long term, whether you want to trade him, whatever you want to do. I think waiting on him specifically probably makes the most sense. But again, I do like hearing that the Orioles are at least listening, that if someone brings up Dylan Bundy, they're not automatically hanging up the phone on a potential contender or potential trade partner. And that's where they need to be, quite frankly. I mean, when you're talking about a team that's won 28% of its games through the first 100, you're not close. You're not in a position where you're reloading next year or trying to revamp. I mean, you're needing to tear down most of it and rebuild most of it. So if you're in that kind of a position, everything needs to be on the table. And you mentioned Brad Brock, and I'm glad you did, because to me, you look at where Brad Brock is right now, and that is a great kind of lesson to impart on any front office with a young, controllable reliever like Michael Givens, who has drawn plenty of interest the last couple years as far as teams being interested in his services. I think Brad Brock, even though he's older, and I don't want to compare the two because they're not exactly apples to apples, but a great example of how volatile commodities, especially pitching commodities, can be, and that's why I wouldn't hesitate whatsoever to trade Michael Givens if someone's going to give me a really good return. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next week. I think clearly Zach Britton's the big one, and the one that I think everyone anticipates going next, and the one who's going to fetch the largest return, assuming they don't trade a Dylan Bundy, who would certainly have some value, some good value as a young, controllable starting pitcher. But it's going to be interesting to see how many rumors are out there, and it's going to be interesting to see what this team looks like come August 1st. It's definitely going to be intriguing. I assume Britton's going to move, barring something weird. I think we all assume that. But
And that unto itself is a little bit of a miracle that they're going to get something for him, because when the injury happened in the offseason, we're like, well, they're getting nothing for him. It's a real tribute to him. And, I put together my Dear Orioles letter to Zach Britton in haste on Sunday morning because I thought they might have traded him by the end of the day. I mean, he might be gone by the time we're speaking at this point. But at whatever point he goes, I've put together some Zach Britton notes about his stay here and his time here. And he's a fascinating, I guess, a compelling person in the history of Oriole baseball because of what happened in Toronto 2 years ago.
Oh, not just that, but he also had arguably the greatest season ever for a relief pitcher 2 years ago. I mean, it's not just being left in the bullpen against the Blue Jays while Ubaldo Jimenez gave up the season-ending home run. It's that came on the heels of Zach Britton being one of the greatest relievers of all time for a single season. So I think from that standpoint, it has been a testament to him that he's been able to get back on the field, get back on the mound, and after clearly some hiccups, and there's no question about that, and he's still paying for that, I think, a little bit from a statistical standpoint, as far as probably certain teams looking at that and saying, okay, he's looked a lot better, but he's still walking a few too many, and you still have some doubts about the forearm last year, and certainly making sure that the Achilles is sound and that he's fine covering first base. So there's still a little bit of doubt here and there, and that might ultimately prevent teams from making their absolute best offer, but the way he has pitched over the last 2.5 weeks or so, much more like the Zach Britton of old, and really a testament to his hard work, a testament to the Orioles training staff for putting him on a program to get him not just back on the mound before the deadline, but back on the mound long enough to get over some of those early hiccups, and for him to be in a position that he can fetch the Orioles at least a good piece. Is it going to be Yusniel Diaz, which was the centerpiece of the Machado trade? Probably not, but I wouldn't at all be surprised to see Zach Britton fetch the Orioles a good piece and maybe another interesting piece to go along with that. And to your point, when he tore his Achilles the week before Christmas back in the offseason, no one would have thought that. I mean, the instant reaction when he tore his Achilles was,
well, there's two prospects we're not getting from the Cubs or whatever.
There's $12 million down the drain, and there's two prospects that they're not going to get, and they should have moved them last year, which, by the way, still could be ultimately prove to be true that they should have traded them last year, depending on what the return is now compared to some of the names that were at least rumored at that point in time. But it's certainly good to see him pitching to the level that he has here over the last couple of weeks, and good to see the Orioles be able to salvage some value for someone who's been really important to their success prior to 2017.
Well, Britton's going to get dealt. I don't know that Adam Jones is absolutely positively going to get dealt. I think he's 9-5 to get dealt, but I don't think he's even money at this point because I think he has to agree to it. The temperature for him over the next 10 days, and this last homestand maybe being his last homestand this week, we go into a whole nother mode of, not are they going to lose 110 or 120 games? They are. The question is, where are these guys going to go and who is going to get dealt? And scope is even more fascinating because you look at it and say, should they or shouldn't they? I don't want to be sitting here 2 years from now where we get up on the trading deadline and he's still hitting 231. But I think if you look on the back of Jonathan Scope's bubblegum card, you can make a case that he is the guy who's going to hit 270, 280, and hit 25 or 30 home runs, much more so than whatever the first 2 months of this season was.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. But at the same time, whoever's taking him, they're thinking about the now. They're thinking over the next 2.5 months, and they're not necessarily going to be convinced, even though he has hit much better over the month of July, hit a couple home runs in Toronto, so he's swinging the bat better.
He's probably a guy you want on your team next year, right? He's a guy, if he comes to camp and locks down second base for you, no matter where you are, you've got an asset there. I would think that I'm not saying the Orioles are going to get full value out of him if they were to deal him batting .231, but I still think he's a very well thought of guy. And I think he's thought of as a guy that is not going to be out of baseball 3 years from now. He's going to be a guy that's going to get a deal and is going to right himself. But I think he's a lost soul here without Machado. I think the Orioles sort of see that and see that maybe this isn't a bad time to move on from him because they're certainly not in a position to give him $80 million.
Yeah, I mean, they could, but I don't know if he's going to take that. I mean, I don't know what the markup would be for him or for anyone, quite frankly. You know, I've heard so many people talk about Adam Jones in a context of trade Adam to a contender, maybe he wins a World Series, and maybe he could come back. I guess in the way that Mike Bordick did years ago.
Surhoff did that too, yes.
Yeah. So, and look, that sounds warm and fuzzy. And believe me, I love Adam Jones, and I love what he's done for the city of Baltimore off the field as much as on it. But I don't see a fit there on a number of levels. I don't think necessarily he wants to be there. I don't for a rebuilding effort that this clearly is going to be for the foreseeable future. And if you look at the Orioles, where they do have some depth from a minor league, from a prospect standpoint, it's in the outfield. Because you have Diaz, you have Austin Hayes, you have Cedric Mullins, you have Ryan McKenna. So you kind of go down the list. That's kind of the one area where, not that they couldn't add more by any means, I'm not saying that, but that there is some youth. So, I think in the case of Scope, what's the markup? What's the overpay? What does that need to be in order to keep him? And I'll say this, because he has had this rough of a season, and look, no one should have expected him to match or better what he did a year ago in what has clearly been his career year. But is there enough of a track record with what he had done prior to that point to justify overpaying just to keep him around? I think that's a fair question. I do. And from that standpoint, because you weren't willing to pay or at least try to pay Manny Machado an extraordinary amount of money, I don't know if that means you should overpay for Jonathan Scope on a long-term deal. So they got to figure it out, and I'm guessing you won't see him moved in the next week, but you hope that
this organization never does anything bold like that. They've never made that kind of a decision ever, which was one of the reasons they choked up on Machado 2 years ago, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess you could...
Historically, they haven't done this.
Right. I mean, I guess you could say to some level, when they moved Eric Bedard when they did, it's not as though he was a rental.
Sure.
They did that in the off season. But, yeah, I mean, it's pretty rare. And, I still think their best play might just be to wait on Scope until this winter and then decide what you're doing at that point. I think that's probably the best bet there. But in the case of Jones, and that I've kind of had my reservations about whether he's ultimately going to be moved or not. I think people forget over and over and over, Adam Jones is making some good money this year. I mean, this is the final year of his 6-year, $85.5 million contract. He's making more than Manny Machado was making this year. So it's not simply finding a fit that where he's going to waive his 10-5 rights. It's not simply finding a fit for a team that wants Adam, presumably, to play a corner outfield spot, unless they really have a need in center field. And we've talked at length about his defense and his need to move off of center field. And I think Adam realizes that, and I think Adam would be willing to do that.
But you're doing the Orioles a favor by taking $5.5–6 million of salary. You're not going to give him a play or two.
Well, and that's the thing. So the money that a team is going to have to pay, if you're just doing a straight-up deal, you're not going to get much. So do you try to match him with someone else? Is there a fit for a Zach Britton, a team that also needs a corner outfielder, and you pair those two, and maybe you throw in a couple $1 million to try to sweeten the return?
Or to put this into perspective, if you're buying Adam Jones, you have to buy Cal Ripken's house twice, once in August and once in September in order to pay him, literally.
Yeah.
Literally.
So I mean, I think it's definitely something that I don't think is a slam dunk. I'd like to see Adam moved because, I mean, my goodness, him playing out the string for a team that might lose 117 games before he hits free agency and likely departs. I mean, as much as it'd be painful on a different level than Machado to see Jones moved as well, I think any Orioles fan who truly appreciates Jones to the degree that he deserves would like to see him move on to a place where he has a chance to win a World Series. Not just this year, but over the next couple years. So, I mean, to your point, this homestand might be it for Adam Jones, at least now. Maybe he comes back 4 years from now to play his final season in Baltimore. I wouldn't rule something like that out in his case compared to, I would rule that out for Manny Machado, unless we're talking about a 38-year-old Machado.
Unless they move Miami to Baltimore, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see that for Manny, but I could see that for Jones. But again, some of these scenarios that have been presented where you trade him and then he comes back, I'm just not sure that's a good fit for either side at this point. So, I'll say what I said weeks ago when we were talking about Machado. Every time the Orioles would come home from a road trip, appreciate him while you can, watch him while you can, and in the same way, Adam Jones, what he's meant to this organization, to this city on a number of different levels. If and when that trade does come in the next week, or maybe it doesn't, we're talking about him at the end of the season, or maybe he's someone who passes through waivers and you can trade him in August. That's a possibility with someone like him with that salary. Appreciate it while you can, and try to enjoy what very, very, very little enjoyment you can get out of watching this year's version of the Orioles. It's all about trying to pick out those little moments or watch those select players. And I know Adam Jones is someone I'm going to be watching and probably getting a little nostalgic here over the next week.
Oh, it'll get dusty around here, I think, before it's over with. The Dear Orioles letters are up at WNST.net. I got one coming for Adam Jones, as well as for Zach Britton before he is dealt here this week. And then there's the Bundy Gosman thing and the notion of dealing them, Luke. Anything you want to say about what that would have to look like? I mean, this whole notion of upheaval and getting rid of guys, and none of these guys are helping them sell tickets. I don't think any of these guys are contributing to a playoff performance in 2019 or 20. So to maybe say about Bundy, well, his arm's already fallen off once. Let's get the value and let's get younger. Let's get some 20, 21, 22-year-old pipeline guys around here. Not a bad idea, but, and I went through this with Alan earlier, I'm still perplexed by all of it that they're going to allow Dan Duquette to be the keeper of the flame in all of this when on October the 9th he's not going to be employed here anymore.
Well, I mean, the one thing you can say, and I think one way, because there's been a lot of talk about what he said on the conference call the night that they moved Machado, talked a lot about this organization pivoting, wanting to put more into player development, talking about the international market, and actions will speak louder than words. It's good to hear those things. There's no question about that, but Duquette being the one to deliver it, certainly.
He's also the one that sat in the chair there with none of that happening and apparently couldn't make it happen. Couldn't get through to the old man, couldn't get through to these kids, cement heads, that signing Venezuelan players might be a good idea if you're a baseball organization.
Sure.
Maybe.
But the one different variable there is Lou and John Angelos weren't calling the show 4 years ago. So, maybe. And again, actions speak louder than words.
But if you're running the place and you know you're doing the wrong thing, all of a sudden you speak up as though we just discovered Korea a week and a half ago. It's, to say we're now going to commit to this. Well, what the hell have you been doing the last 5 years?
Well,
that begs a question in a normal organization. But this isn't a normal we're not allowed to ask tough questions here as to why all of a sudden you discover Cuba last week. But yes.
I hear what you're saying, but you can't make a change until you change. So, if they do make that change, then that'll be for the better, certainly.
And talking about it is not doing it either. And certainly talking about it, then doing it well and mastering it, that's a whole different level.
Right.
All these other teams are already in there. To say we're going to be the 30th team on the island when the Astros have had an academy down there for 25 years.
Oh, it's going to take time. It's great to say you're going to spend. That's going to be something that takes a few years to even start moving the meter. I mean, that's just reality.
You're worried for the pipeline of Yusniel Diaz. I mean, imagine the pipeline for some 13-year-old boy in the Dominican right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, so it's something that's going to take time. And look, I mean, actions speak louder than words. But I'll say this, and this goes back to what we've kind of been clamoring for all season. It's good to hear someone in the organization. And should it be ownership? Yeah, I think it absolutely should, but it wasn't. But it's good to hear someone talk about those terms and talk about making some changes and revamping some things, because God knows their record reflects at 28 and 72 over their first 100 games that they need to make some changes, and they need to make some meaningful changes. So from that standpoint, it's good to hear the message as it relates to Dan Duquette. Hey, I mean, by all accounts, he was the one who he did the heavy lifting for the Machado deal, and for the most part, there have been positive reviews on that in comparison to, let's say, what the Mets got for Juris Familia over the weekend, where that's been panned, and people were saying, well, why did they didn't get anything for him? So, so it's at least been good to see that. And I guess the one flip side way you can look at it with Duquette, assuming he's not going to be back and assuming he is simply kind of interviewing for his next job, he wants to do a good job. And I think other people in the industry will recognize the return that he got from Manny Machado and recognize the body of work here over the last 5 or 6 years, which wasn't perfect. And you know me, I'm not a huge Dan Duquette guy. I don't think he walks on water by any means, but I do think he's done a better job than some people in town want to give him credit for. And some of the things that he's been criticized for aren't necessarily, that anger is misguided or should be directed higher than Dan Duquette. So, what that means in terms of the next week, whether they trade a Bundy, whether they trade a Gausman, I'm guessing they probably won't. But in the case of those individuals, to your point, if you're not going to contend in 19 and 20, and even if things go exceptionally well and you find a lot of really special minor league talent over the next couple years, and some of the guys you have in your system prove to be really special, even 2021, you're looking at things needing to go really, really well probably for them to be a contender. If that's the scenario, and that looks like that's the path, then it makes sense to be looking into moving Gausman and Bundy and Givens and certainly Scope that we've talked about a whole lot. It makes sense to move those guys, because by the time you're ready by the time you're in a position where you're thinking about having a good chance of winning again, then those guys are going to be hitting the free agent market. So I think, from that standpoint, it makes sense. And, yeah, in a perfect world, you'd have a long-term baseball ops guy calling the shots here right now. But if you don't, well, Dan Duquette is at the very least kind of interviewing and doing things to try to make himself look as appealing as possible for his next job. And from that context, I think there could be worse ways than having this play out than having Dan Duquette making the call on some of these calls, or at least fetching the offers and then the organization making a call, no matter how that decision is made ultimately.
He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. He's going to be monitoring all things Orioles deals. If there is breaking news, we'll have it out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, and, of course, on the WNST text service. It is our #1 service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford off Security Boulevard, and Dennis Colazzos will be here on Thursday driving you home from 3 until 5. It is the SSV on WNST. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. We still have some space left on the Ray Lewis bus for next weekend. Also, my Nashville 50th birthday trip coming up in October. You can learn more under the Road Trips tab. I am writing Dear Orioles letters. Zach Britton is next up, then Adam Jones, and I don't know who else is going to be kicked off the island here before the 31st and the trading deadline next Tuesday. But the Orioles are home all week against the Red Sox, against the Rays this weekend after the sweep at the hands of the Blue Jays this weekend. Luke will be on the backfields in Owings Mills all week long as well. And anything you miss, and there's lots of conversation about the Ravens, about Ray Lewis. Lots of Ravens alums going to be joining us here this week to discuss the legend of Ray Lewis, as well as some best of stuff from some Super Bowls where Ray Lewis is the topic of conversation amongst John Ogden, amongst Rod Woodson, amongst other players. So you'll find all that in the buyatoyota.com audio vault and at AM 1570 all week long. Whew. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.